Wow, I'm really happy to not only be here with Louie Palu. Louie, who are you, first of all?
I'm a photographer, and I've covered war and conflict for about 10 years and been a photographer for about 28.
So a modern war photographer here, not only on the Gettysburg battlefield, but arguably at one of the most documented places at Gettysburg during the Civil War, certainly the most documented single farm at Gettysburg in terms of war photography. This is the Rose Farm. What do you know about this place?
Well, this is the place that most of the most famous pictures from Alexander Gardner and Timothy Sullivan came out of the photography after the battle here in Gettysburg.
Good. So, and what happens is in 1967, after a years-long search, my mentor, William A. Fresnito, the mentor of many people actually, eventually discovered this book and discovered this location that a lot of photos were taken here, and took a nicer book than my particularly beat-up copy and published Gettysburg: A Journey in Time, and blew open where these photos were taken and really destroyed a lot of myths that these were not dead of the Iron Brigade, they were not dead of the 1st Minnesota, they were in fact dead taken on a nondescript farm here at Gettysburg.
Yeah, I think that's really important to have all the facts and to correct or amend history for its accuracy, for sure.
Yeah, and this is your first time specifically out here, is that right?
This is the first time on this part of the battlefield, definitely.
Okay, well, let's do this right now. We're going to do a little walkabout, and this is a great place to start. I think you've seen this photo before,
yeah.
right? So let's actually orient this way if we can, okay? Now, if you look at it this way, again, these photos are all taken in 3D, so they're taken low to the ground. And what I can see here is a line of bodies here and another line of bodies there. And if I look over on the left, I can see a distinctive crack in a low boulder. You see that crack right there?
Totally.
Aha! Okay. How do I know this? Well, Fresnito in 1967 came out and was looking for this boulder right here, which if you look right over there, there it is, okay? And you can see some of the other ones. So once he had this as sort of the Rosetta Stone, he knew that the line of bodies was right here. There was another line, and a guy with a bent knee caught his attention. He'd already recognized that he could see this same guy in several different photos. So what I want to do now is walk over to some of the other photos taken of this particular group here. So let's go. Now, as we walk, I'd like to hand out 3D glasses here, because most Civil War photos, 80% or more, were recorded in 3D.
I think that's a fantastic fact, that a lot of these, everything's 3D is a modern thing. I love anything that causes people to ask questions.
Okay, so now first, before you put them on,
okay,
check this out. So you can see that rock on the left.
Yeah.
It's clearly that same boulder there.
Yeah.
We know it because the guy with the bent knee is right there, and we know it. But when you take these 3D photos, and again, let me stress, the photographers had no thought other than that people would only see these in 3D, not on big boards with red and blue glasses, but rather through stereo viewers, stereoscopes like, you know, we've all seen in our parents' and grandparents' houses, and they're still available now. Don't bid against me. But when you put them on, they turn into like little windows in time, and suddenly you're looking back into the past. And right from where you are, Louie, I think you can see that the boulder almost lines up.
Oh yeah. Well, I think also it's about experientiality, right? It's about this being a window to a place a lot of people can't go. You know?
Yeah. What else do you see here, seeing this for the first time?
Well, I just got to get past the fact that I'm seeing it in 3 dimensions, because, you know, in many ways, photographs are truths, but they're not the real thing. They're things that help our imagination see something that we can't see in person. And I think that, or an experience. And when I look here, I mean, there's no way those trees can be the same trees, I guess.
Correct.
So they're different trees. There's a boulder.
If you look off in the distance, you can see a distant set of woods. Those are in the exact same spot.
Yeah, actually, and then there's that fold in the ground there.
Yeah, which you'd never be able to see in 2 dimensions properly, right?
Totally.
Now let me ask you a question. So here's a photo Alexander Gardner took, one of many on this particular farm. When you record a photo at a place, does that place hold any particular emotion or otherwise for you?
Well, I think it all depends what narrative has been given to you. I think a lot of what happens in the news and any history or of any kind or storytelling is the power of narrative, and the use of narrative to change something into something it is not, or into something that the author wants you to experience. And I think that by photographing it here, it gives, there's dimension here, and that may have driven the way the photographs were taken.
Good, very interesting. And you can see, yes, undulations in the ground you couldn't otherwise see. Now, let's keep this same group of bodies in mind, okay? And you can see now that it's not exactly a line of bodies. There's a few people that are further away.
Yeah.
And by the way, we can talk about who these men were, or to what we know about it, but let's walk on over here as well. And we can now look at these from another direction. So now what we're doing is focusing in upon the guy with the bent knee. I call him the guy with the bent knee because we don't know who he is. We can only guess as to which state he was even from, other than that he's Confederate and probably died on the 2nd day at the Battle of Gettysburg. But we're now looking not only at the first line of bodies, but you can see the second line of bodies next to that same boulder we started at. And then, of course, you can see Gardner's darkroom wagon.
You know what? That is, seeing it in 3D is very, very different, because I'm kind of looking into the wagon, and the initial shock is the dead bodies, and then as a photographer, I'm like, wow, what have you got in this darkroom wagon back there?
Well, what's interesting, of course, is, you know, a lot of people have trouble wrapping their brains around it. That darkroom wagon is in there, and this photo was developed in that darkroom wagon.
Yeah.
You know, how about, you know, on a normal day, I think, so Gardner was particularly productive here. 14 photos known to have been taken on the Rose Farm. That's a pretty productive 4 or 5 hours for Gardner. How would you cover this place, knowing if there were 44 bodies around here? How many photos would you take on a shoot like this in half a day?
Well, I think, you know, we need to establish a couple of things. Gardner, Timothy O'Sullivan, and Matthew Brady were not journalists. I'm a photojournalist, so I could not move the bodies around. Like, we have a code of ethics we follow. So I think the first thing is I would photograph things as they are. I mean, sometimes it'd be about documenting a detail, but I do a wide shot, like a landscape. I would not include my darkroom. I mean, maybe for myself or for history and to show process. But I think that the difficulty back then is to know the carnage that happened here and to take a photo and there's only one body. I think the feeling was, we are just not capturing what really happened here. And it was, you know, it's always easy to have this hindsight of history, like, oh, they moved the bodies, that's unethical, I can't believe that they set it up. But I think that these were people who are breaking new ground in some ways. They were the beginning, and they were because it was 3D, I think that there were things that they needed to happen in the photograph to create the dimension and the depth. How would I photograph? Well, I think I would have probably covered the fighting. I would have had the technology. If I was back then, obviously I'd work with what I had, but I would have, with the technology back then, you can't cover the fighting. The exposures are 20 seconds to 5 minutes, and it's aftermath photography. You wouldn't even know that the battle had happened, really, and you'd already be too late. What is interesting here is, I think what he's trying to convey is the level of carnage in this war. And I think that all of us have to transport ourselves back in time and understand that, you know, seeing photos of dead bodies, especially in this particular fight over these particular ideas, political and ethical, to connect the pictures of the actual killing going on would have been shocking to the public.
Yes.
More so than now, because now we go to Instagram and we see millions of photographs every day. Back then it would have been like an, oh my God. And in some ways it could have steered public opinion.
And it really was sort of a myth buster, right?
It was.
You know, you have people, you know, before the Battle of Antietam thinking war was a pretty glorious event. There was no actual depiction of it. So maybe if you died, your ancestor, your loved one would be on a parapet with a flag draped across his breast, maybe a little blood on him, you know, but all of a sudden the Battle of Antietam happens and Gardner got there with his photos, and at least one journalist famously said, if Mr. Gardner has not dragged the bodies to our doorsteps and placed them in our dooryard, he has done something very like it.
It's one of the most important parts of the history of photography. What ends up happening first in Antietam and then following up to here is that there is a manner of recording an event or the effects or in this case the dead bodies of this battle that brings the reality of war to the public. And I think that that's a huge moment in the history of photography and of the history of this country, where it is the beginning of what we see later in other wars, like say in Vietnam, or the pictures from, I believe it's Tarawa or Paelu with the dead Marines on the beach, where it's just a shock to the public. Like, this is the human cost of what this conflict's costing us.
Yeah, and let's walk to the next spot.
Yes.
But, you know, this is new ground, as you said, right? So, you know, there are no rules for this. Is it okay to photograph dead soldiers? Are you allowed to put
I don't
props?
think people know.
You know, and even then and now there aren't rules. And what I want to address too is that you might think that these photos, they're so terrible, everyone's going to call for a halting of the war, which some people did, right?
Yeah.
But others, including Abraham Lincoln, said, no, these dead must not have died in vain. We need to continue the struggle to make sure that this sacrifice wasn't in vain. So, you know, even swaying public opinion can work in both directions.
No, definitely.
So what we're looking at here is what I would call now the famous V formation. In other words, the Confederates laid their friends out for burial here, but were unable to complete the process, so the Union had to come and do it after they controlled this part of the battlefield. These were almost certainly Georgians, maybe South Carolinians, but all but certainly Georgians here, and they're laid out in a V. What's interesting here is that not only can they be connected to all the other bodies, because there's 3 different photos of the V right here, but the 2 boulders that you see right here are still visible inside the fence line over there if you were to walk over to them. This is how Fresnillo lined this location up. Now, if we were to walk over there too, we would see there's some substantial erosion here. That's because these dead were buried right here where they fell. That's what they did in the Civil War, and they were later exhumed, in this case moved to southern cemeteries in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And for some of the dead on the Rose Farm, we actually know who they are and where they're buried now.
Well, you know, as a photographer, some of the things I start looking at is like their shoes and their, or lack of, or fallen apart footwear, and it kind of tells you a lot of, you know, how they dressed, what their uniforms looked like. And I think that the important thing is that, you know, you could see the size of the wounds. These are all important things to understand the kind of war and the kind of weapons they were using back at that time.
And I think it's tough here to see, but in 3D you can certainly see it. This soldier, again, who charged into battle full of life just 4 days before this photo was taken. They look like grotesque forms now, but his head has somehow been split. It's a particularly gruesome wound. You can see something's going on there.
Well, and you can see where something had hit him right here. And I think, you know, it talks about the carnage and the sort of, you know, it's incredible. One of the things that hit me when I looked at some of the monuments when I first got here from a residency is how many horses were killed here. And I've been looking for more and more pictures of horses. I mean, the numbers vary wildly, like over 1 million horses killed in the Civil War. And I just imagine it's in some ways we're lucky that they actually documented something here. But I imagine if, say, they would have shot another 50 to 100 glass plates.
I wish.
Well, just of you know, the detritus of war. I mean, I can't imagine the photographer arriving and just the shock. Like portraits of whoever buries the dead would have been powerful. Maybe a lot of African Americans doing sort of that work. And I just think it would talk about sort of all the layers of conflict. I think what's interesting as well is there's that famous picture of the Confederate prisoners.
Yes.
And I wonder, a debate, I posted it as an event a lecture I was gonna give. And a debate broke out of how they're posing and how they look. And I'm just like, maybe there were Union guys dressed up in uniform. We don't know. In the end, we really can't say or know.
We don't know.
We don't know. And
although a lot of people proclaim to know, for sure.
Well, that's the whole thing. And in the end, that's why I think works like this book by Fresnillo are really, really key, because I think that in the end, it's about going to the place. And that's what my job is. I go to a place and I document what I'm seeing, and you can look me up as an author of the person who created it. And I think that's what's important about Gardner in all of this is Gardner is working as an employee under Matthew Brady. The Antietam photos are taken. All the credit, maybe in some cases, I guess later on, Gardner gets credit, but everybody thought they were Matthew Brady's photos. It was like he was an employee, so Matthew Brady.
To this day.
Yeah, to this day. And he breaks off, and I think authorship, it's a really important part of the history of photography or anything, is that knowing who actually made it and who was a part of the process was key. And Gardner broke it down, and photographers who worked for him, like Timothy O'Sullivan, he credited him, who made the print, who made the negative. And I think that having all of that is important to understand the key facts that you can follow up on.
And by the way, just taking photos and dividing them into series is one of the most important things that Fresnillo did.
Yes.
In other words, once you know who took it and when and where it was taken, that photo has left the fine arts field to an extent and become a historical document. We know when Gardner was here, therefore he found that Gardner was the only one to record the dead here. We know what parts of the battlefield it was on. It can help us understand history a little better.
No, totally. And I just think of, I mean, there's a lot more than just even taking the pictures. Like, Gardner would have to have a very extensive list of contacts to find out what's going on, how to talk to people, who he knew in what army and at what level. That is an important part of working logistically as a photographer in a war zone. as taking, you can't take the photographs, and there's a lot of layers. You got to get through picket lines, security. They could think you're a spy. How do you explain your way around that? What documents do you have? How can you say, hey, look, I'm not a spy? You know, if you get held up by the Confederates, in some ways, just because of where you're from, even if you're not a part of the other side of a combatant, they may say, how do we know you're not spying on us, you know?
Just as Alexander Gardner did, just several miles south of here.
Exactly.
In Gettysburg.
And he probably talked his way through and said, look, I am, you know, Alexander Gardner. I don't know what he, I would have loved to know, I don't know if he wrote it anywhere, how he did talk to them.
No, there's frustratingly little. In fact, what we really have, as with many photographers, we have his caption of a photo of the place where he was detained by the Confederates. We know they let him go. We know when the photo was taken, but we don't know a whole lot more than that.
But at least we have what we have, and we can follow it up. And I champion Gardner a lot because if he would not have left Matthew Brady, if he would have just thought, oh, okay, I work for this guy, I don't care if I get credited, then a lot of this history would have been lost. And I think that in some ways, by breaking off from Brady, who is equally as important for the whole Civil War and photographing it, is he starts breaking down the things that have given us even the small amounts of information that we do have.
One other thing I want to point out on this photo is there's so many gruesome elements, but somehow this one speaks to me. Again, remember, these are somebody's brother, dad, husband, and if you look all the way down the list here, you can see a guy his eyes are actually bulging out of his head. And I mean, again, I just can't stress enough. Imagine if this is your relative. Somebody back probably in Georgia is awaiting, you know, word of this poor soldier's fate.
Yeah.
And you know, and again, many of them are going to be disappointed before long when their father, brother, husband doesn't come home after this. It's easy enough to look at these people as sort of these grotesque forms, but no, they're just like us. And I suppose you know that, photographing these places.
Yes. No, and I just think, you know, kind of, I think of Walt Whitman's incredible writing about the Civil War. And I just think of if Walt Whitman would have been able to write about the process of photographing it and that experience of, you know, that moment where you stop and they move the bodies around and what the smell would have been like. I mean, I've covered war, so I know, and it's something that stays with you psychologically, and it just, that's part of the story or narrative doesn't exist, sort of the aftermath of the photographer's experience of seeing all this carnage, because there is no preparation for them psychologically what they're going to see and experience. Nothing at all.
And this was brand new. I mean, documentary photography, at least in my opinion, was really born the year before on the Virginia Peninsula. And then those of the dead didn't come around until late that year. And then all of a sudden it's happening with a little bit more frequency.
Yeah, it is a very big jump from, you know, Daguerre and Fox Talbot inventing, or whoever did it first around the same time, the photography itself. And it's kind of like, you know, Baudelaire's, the painting is dead, you know, and it's, and that's where photography, and then you jump to this, of how photography uses a tool to record things that have happened, to tell people, hey, oh my God. I think what's really important to understand is that Gardner is following a tradition of documenting scenes of battle that date back to Francisco Goya, the Spanish painter, when he did etchings called The Disasters of War. And these were all allegedly documented scenes of atrocities and scenes of war committed by the Napoleonic army when they invaded Spain. And in some ways, and they're etchings, so you could make multiple copies of them. They had to etch a plate, you know. And I think that that's the incredible part of photography, is that, you know, Alexander Gardner came here, and everybody else, including illustrators, and could use a lot of these photographs as reference to show what it looked like. It wasn't just an imagined scene anymore, or an imagined creation from writing. In some ways, this takes photography and equals it to writing in a lot of ways. Because I would come here as a writer, like, you know, this many bodies, and I write down the facts, and now we can actually see it. And I think that that is a transformative moment in American history.